History loves empires that conquered the world. But what about the ones that conquered time itself? What if I told you that while Europe was stumbling through the Dark Ages, a civilization in southern Africa was building monuments that would make medieval kings weep with envy? And then, without warning, they simply disappeared. This is the story of the master builders of Great Zimbabwe, a people who carved an empire from granite and gold, who traded with China when most Europeans had never seen a map, and who created architectural marvels that stood for centuries. But here's the twist that will blow your mind. We don't even know their real names. The civilization that left behind the most impressive stone structures south of the Sahara vanished so completely that when Europeans first saw their ruins, they refused to believe Africans had built them. Between 1200 and 1450 CE, this mysterious civilization controlled trade routes worth billions in today's money, commanded respect from merchants as far away as Persia, and built a stone city that housed over 18,000 people, making it larger than medieval London. But their greatest achievement wasn't their wealth or their architecture. It was creating a sustainable empire that lasted longer than the Roman Republic, then choosing to abandon it all. How does a thriving metropolis become a ghost town? How does an entire way of life simply end? Picture Africa in the 13th century. While Europeans fought over scraps of land and struggled with basic hygiene, the continent was experiencing a golden age. Mali controlled the gold trade in the west, Ethiopian kingdoms dominated the highlands in the east, and in the south, a new power was rising, the Zimbabwe Plateau. A land of rolling hills, granite outcrops, and mineral wealth beyond imagination was becoming the stage for one of history's most sophisticated civilizations. This wasn't the Africa of colonial stereotypes. This was a continent of international trade, advanced metallurgy, and political sophistication that would make Renaissance princes jealous. The Indian Ocean was a highway of commerce connecting African ports to Arabia, India, and China. Gold, ivory, and exotic goods flowed east, while silk, porcelain, and new technologies flowed back. And at the heart of this network sat one city that would become legend. Sometime around 1200 CE, a group of Shona-speaking people looked at a massive granite hill and made a decision that would echo through centuries. They would build not just a settlement, but a statement. Using no mortar, no blueprints, and techniques that still puzzle engineers today, they began constructing what would become the largest ancient structure south of the Sahara Desert. But this wasn't just about architecture. This was about power, trade, and creating something that would last forever. What they couldn't have known was that their greatest triumph would also become their greatest mystery. The same people who carved their legacy in stone would vanish from history, leaving behind only questions and one of archaeology's most enduring puzzles. The story begins with cattle, gold, and a stroke of geographic genius that would reshape southern Africa forever. Around 1000 CE, the Shona people were already masters of their environment. They understood the seasonal patterns of the Zimbabwe Plateau, knew which grasses fed cattle best, and had discovered something that would change everything. The land beneath their feet was rich with gold. But unlike other civilizations that built their power on conquest, the Shona built theirs on something far more sustainable: trade. Imagine yourself as a Shona herder in the 11th century. You're walking across the granite landscape when you notice something glinting in a stream. Gold. Not just flakes, but nuggets. You follow the stream and discover that this entire region is shot through with gold-bearing quartz veins. But here's what made the Shona different from every other civilization that discovered gold. They didn't become consumed by it. They saw it as one resource among many, a tool for building something greater. The early Shona settlements were sophisticated from the start. They practiced advanced agriculture, rotating crops, and managing soil fertility with techniques that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. They bred cattle not just for meat and milk, but as living symbols of wealth and status. Most importantly, they developed trade networks that stretched across the continent. By 1100 CE, Shona merchants were regular fixtures at the coastal trading posts of Kilwa and Sofala. Arab and Persian traders knew them by reputation. Honest dealers who delivered quality goods. Chinese porcelain began appearing in Shona settlements, along with glass beads from India and silk from the Middle East. But the Shona weren't just passive participants in this trade. They were orchestrating it. The genius of early Shona civilization lay in their approach to power. Instead of building massive armies or conquering neighboring peoples, they created something more valuable: trust. Their word became their bond in international markets. When a Shona trader promised to deliver a certain quantity of gold or ivory by a specific date, it happened. This reliability made them indispensable partners in the Indian Ocean trade network. But around 1200 CE, something changed. Archaeological evidence shows a sudden explosion in construction activity and population growth. What happened? The answer lies in understanding how the Shona viewed leadership and community. Unlike European feudalism or Asian dynastic systems, Shona society was built around a concept called ukama, a complex web of kinship and reciprocal obligation that created social stability without rigid hierarchy. Leaders earned their position through demonstrated wisdom and success, not just inheritance. This meant that power was always accountable to the community's well-being. The decision to build Great Zimbabwe wasn't made by a single king or emperor. It emerged from collective leadership recognizing an opportunity. The plateau's granite formations provided perfect building material and defensive advantages. The location sat at the intersection of multiple trade routes. Most importantly, it offered something precious in the medieval world: security. Construction began on what we now call the Hill Complex, a series of stone enclosures built into and around a massive granite kopje. These weren't simple walls. They were architectural marvels, fitted together with a precision that still baffles engineers. The builders used a technique called dry stone walling, cutting and shaping granite blocks to fit together perfectly without mortar. But here's what makes this achievement extraordinary. They had no written language, no blueprints, and no mechanical tools beyond what they could craft by hand. Every block was shaped using iron tools and transported using human labor. The precision required generations of accumulated knowledge passed down through master craftsmen. The first major triumph came around 1250 CE, when Great Zimbabwe successfully mediated a trade dispute between coastal merchants and interior suppliers. The city's leaders demonstrated something that would become their trademark: the ability to find solutions that benefited everyone. This wasn't just diplomacy. It was a new model of international relations based on mutual prosperity rather than zero-sum competition. Word spread through the trading networks. Great Zimbabwe wasn't just another market town. It was a place where deals could be made, disputes resolved, and long-term partnerships forged. Merchants began making pilgrimages to the city, not just to trade, but to witness this new form of African urban civilization. By 1300 CE, Great Zimbabwe was home to over 10,000 people and controlled trade routes stretching from the Zambezi River to the Indian Ocean. The city's warehouses held goods from across the known world: Persian carpets, Chinese porcelain, Indian textiles, and Arabian silver. But the real treasure was something less tangible: the knowledge and connections that made Great Zimbabwe the hub of southern African commerce. The Shona had achieved something remarkable. They had built a civilization that prospered not through conquest or exploitation, but through creating value for others. They had turned their geographic advantages into economic power, and their cultural wisdom into international influence. But success, as history repeatedly teaches us, carries the seeds of its own challenges. The wealth flowing through Great Zimbabwe was beginning to attract attention from powers who didn't share the Shona philosophy of mutual benefit. The first triumph was complete, but the real test was just beginning. What happened next would transform Great Zimbabwe from a successful trading city into the heart of an Utu empire that controlled the economic destiny of half a continent. The transformation began with a revolution in thinking that was centuries ahead of its time. Instead of hoarding their wealth or using it to build armies, the rulers of Great Zimbabwe made a decision that would define their civilization. They invested in infrastructure and knowledge. Picture the city at its peak around 1350 CE. The Great Enclosure, a massive stone wall nearly 250 meters in circumference, rises from the valley floor like something from a fantasy novel. But this wasn't built for show. Every curve, every entrance, every internal division served a purpose. The elliptical design maximized enclosed space while minimizing building materials. The internal structures created specialized areas for different trades and social functions. Most ingeniously, the walls were designed to channel airflow, creating natural climate control in the southern African heat. But the real genius lay in what you couldn't see. Beneath the impressive stonework ran a sophisticated water management system. Channels carved into the granite bedrock collected rainwater and directed it to storage areas. Drainage systems prevented flooding during the rainy season. The builders had created a sustainable urban environment that could support a large population year-round. The population explosion that followed was unlike anything seen in medieval Africa. Archaeological evidence suggests that at its peak, the greater Great Zimbabwe area housed between 18,000 and 20,000 people. To put this in perspective, this made it larger than medieval London, Paris, or any European city north of the Alps. But unlike European cities of the time, Great Zimbabwe was clean, well-organized, and prosperous. The secret to managing this urban explosion lay in Shona social technology, systems of organization that balanced individual opportunity with collective responsibility. The city was divided into distinct areas based on profession and social role, but movement between areas was fluid. Craft specialists lived near the Great Enclosure, farmers in the surrounding valleys, and traders in quarters near the main gates. Yet all were part of an integrated economic and social system. The sophistication of Great Zimbabwe's economy during this period is staggering. Archaeological excavations have revealed evidence of specialized production areas for ironworking, gold processing, pottery making, and textile production. But this wasn't just local craft production. This was industrial organization that supplied international markets. Consider the gold trade alone. Great Zimbabwe's traders didn't just dig up gold and sell it raw. They developed sophisticated refining techniques that produced gold of such purity that it commanded premium prices in international markets. They created standardized weights and measures that became trusted throughout the Indian Ocean trading network. Most importantly, they established quality control systems that guaranteed the authenticity of their products. The ivory trade was equally sophisticated. Great Zimbabwe's hunters and traders didn't just kill elephants indiscriminately. They developed sustainable hunting practices that maintained elephant populations while meeting international demand. They processed ivory using techniques that maximized the value of each tusk, creating products ranging from jewelry to decorative objects that were prized in courts from Arabia to China. But the real foundation of Great Zimbabwe's power was something less tangible: information. The city became the communication hub for southern Africa. Traders arriving from the coast brought news from the wider world. Travelers from the interior shared information about political developments, resource discoveries, and market opportunities. The rulers of Great Zimbabwe didn't just accumulate this intelligence, they synthesized it into strategic advantage. This information network allowed Great Zimbabwe to anticipate market changes, identify new opportunities, and avoid potential conflicts before they erupted. When demand for a particular product increased in distant markets, Great Zimbabwe's traders were often the first to respond. When political instability threatened trade routes, they had alternative networks ready to activate. The diplomatic genius of Great Zimbabwe during this period rivals that of Renaissance Italy or ancient Greece. The city's leaders developed a foreign policy based on what we might today call enlightened self-interest. They understood that their prosperity depended on the stability and success of their trading partners, so they actively worked to promote regional peace and development. Great Zimbabwe's diplomatic influence extended far beyond its immediate region. Arab chroniclers from the time describe Zimbabwean ambassadors appearing at courts in Kilwa, Mogadishu, and even as far away as Hormuz. These weren't just trade missions, they were sophisticated diplomatic operations designed to build long-term relationships and influence regional politics. The military power that backed up this diplomacy was formidable but restrained. Archaeological evidence suggests that Great Zimbabwe maintained a professional warrior class, but these forces were used primarily for defensive purposes and to protect trade routes. Unlike their contemporaries in Europe or Asia, the Zimbabweans rarely used military force to expand territory or impose tribute relationships. Instead, they developed something far more effective: economic integration. Communities throughout the region found that cooperating with Great Zimbabwe was more profitable than competing with it. The city offered technology transfer, access to international markets, and protection from raiders. In return, they received loyalty, resources, and strategic intelligence. By 1400 CE, Great Zimbabwe's influence stretched from the Zambezi River in the north to the Limpopo in the south, from the eastern highlands to the Kalahari Desert. This wasn't an empire in the traditional sense. There were no governors, tribute collectors, or occupying armies. Instead, it was something more sophisticated: a network of voluntary cooperation held together by mutual benefit. The cultural flowering that accompanied this economic and political success was extraordinary. Great Zimbabwe became a center of learning and innovation that attracted scholars, artists, and craftspeople from across Africa and the Indian Ocean world. The city's artisans developed distinctive styles in pottery, metalwork, and stone carving that influenced aesthetic traditions throughout the region. Religious and philosophical developments during this period were equally significant. The Shona spiritual system, built around ancestral reverence and environmental harmony, evolved into a sophisticated theological framework that provided meaning and social cohesion for the diverse population of Great Zimbabwe. The famous Zimbabwe birds, carved soapstone sculptures found at the site, represent the synthesis of traditional beliefs with cosmopolitan influences. But perhaps most remarkably, Great Zimbabwe achieved something that eluded most medieval civilizations: environmental sustainability. The city's prosperity was built on renewable resources managed through traditional ecological knowledge passed down through generations. Cattle herding, agriculture, and even mining were conducted using practices that maintained long-term environmental health. Archaeological evidence shows no signs of environmental degradation around Great Zimbabwe during its peak period. Soil remained fertile, water sources stayed clean, and wildlife populations remained stable. The Zimbabweans had solved a problem that would challenge civilizations for centuries to come: how to maintain prosperity without destroying the environment that sustains it. Yet even as Great Zimbabwe reached its zenith of power and influence, subtle changes were beginning that would ultimately lead to its mysterious decline. Climate data suggests that rainfall patterns were becoming less predictable. Political changes in the coastal city-states were altering traditional trade relationships. Most ominously, new powers were emerging in the region that didn't share Zimbabwe's philosophy of cooperative prosperity. The golden age of Great Zimbabwe represented humanity at its best: innovative, sustainable, and inclusive. But history has a way of testing even the most successful civilizations. The greatest challenge lay ahead: and it would reveal whether the values and systems that built Great Zimbabwe were strong enough to survive fundamental change. The beginning of the end came not with war or conquest, but with something far more insidious: success itself becoming a prison of expectations, and the slow erosion of the very principles that built the empire. By 1420 CE, Great Zimbabwe faced a crisis that its founders never anticipated. The city had become too successful for its own good. The population had grown beyond what the immediate environment could sustainably support. The granite quarries that provided building stone were showing signs of exhaustion. Most critically, the delicate balance between local production and international trade was shifting in ways that threatened the entire economic foundation. Climate change struck the first devastating blow. Paleoclimatic evidence shows that around 1420 CE, the region entered a period of decreased rainfall that lasted for several decades. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an existential threat to a civilization built on cattle herding and agriculture. Pastures that had supported thousands of cattle for centuries began to fail. Agricultural yields dropped dramatically. The environmental sustainability that had been Great Zimbabwe's greatest achievement was being tested by forces beyond human control. The leadership faced an impossible choice. They could abandon their traditional extensive agriculture and cattle management, concentrating resources to maintain the urban population. Or they could maintain their traditional way of life and accept that the city could no longer support its current population. Both options required abandoning core principles that had guided Zimbabwean civilization for centuries. But the external pressures were even more challenging than the environmental ones. Portuguese explorers had rounded the Cape of Good Hope and were beginning to establish trading posts along the East African coast. Unlike the Arab and Persian traders who had been content to work within existing systems, the Portuguese brought a different philosophy: exclusive control and monopoly profits. The Portuguese disrupted trade relationships that had been stable for centuries. They offered higher prices for gold and ivory, but demanded exclusive trading rights in return. Communities that had been loyal partners of Great Zimbabwe for generations began to question whether the old relationships still served their interests. Meanwhile, new powers were rising in the region. The Mutapa Kingdom, founded by people with cultural connections to Great Zimbabwe, was establishing itself in the Zambezi Valley. The emerging Torwa Kingdom was competing for control of trade routes in the west. These weren't external invasions. They were internal fragmentations as the costs of maintaining the Great Zimbabwe system began to outweigh the benefits for peripheral communities. The crisis deepened. As Great Zimbabwe's traditional conflict resolution mechanisms proved inadequate for dealing with these new challenges. The consensus-based decision-making that had served the civilization well during periods of growth and prosperity became paralyzed when faced with choices that offered no good options. Archaeological evidence from this period tells a story of increasing social stratification and internal tension. The egalitarian principles that had characterized earlier periods gave way to more rigid class distinctions. Luxury goods became concentrated in elite areas, while common residential zones showed signs of declining material conditions. The social technology that had been Great Zimbabwe's greatest innovation was breaking down under pressure. The final crisis came around 1450 CE, when the leadership made a decision that would haunt historians for centuries. Rather than adapt to changed circumstances, they chose to abandon the city entirely. This wasn't a sudden evacuation. Archaeological evidence suggests it was a planned, gradual withdrawal that took place over several years. Some population moved north to establish new settlements in the Zambezi Valley, eventually founding the Mutapa Kingdom that would dominate the region for the next 2 centuries. Others moved west, contributing to the rise of the Torwa Kingdom centered at Kami. Still others integrated into smaller communities throughout the region, carrying with them the knowledge and cultural traditions of Great Zimbabwe. But the city itself was left to the wind and rain. Within a generation, the sophisticated urban civilization that had taken centuries to build was returning to nature. The Great Walls remained, but the human knowledge that had given them meaning was dispersed across the landscape. The tragic irony is that Great Zimbabwe didn't fail because of any fundamental flaw in its approach to civilization. It succeeded so completely that it created conditions its founders couldn't have anticipated. The very prosperity and stability that made it great also made it inflexible when faced with rapid change. The consensus-based decision-making that had been a source of strength became a source of paralysis when choices had to be made quickly. Most heartbreaking of all, the principles that guided Great Zimbabwe, environmental sustainability, cooperative prosperity, and peaceful conflict resolution, were exactly what the world needed as it entered an era of European colonial expansion and environmental exploitation. But history had moved beyond the moment when those principles could be easily implemented on a large scale. The last residents of Great Zimbabwe left behind a mystery that would puzzle scholars for centuries, but also a legacy that would inspire future generations seeking alternatives to conquest and exploitation as the foundations of civilization. The immediate aftermath of Great Zimbabwe's abandonment was a silence that echoed across centuries. The ruins stood like a question mark carved in granite, challenging everyone who encountered them to explain how such sophistication could simply vanish. When Portuguese explorers first reported the ruins in the 16th century, they couldn't conceive that Africans had built such structures. European colonial authorities in the 19th and early 20th centuries created elaborate theories attributing the construction to Phoenicians, Arabs, or even lost biblical civilizations, anyone except the African ancestors of the Shona people who still lived in the region and maintained oral traditions about the site. This denial reveals something profound about the challenge Great Zimbabwe poses to conventional historical narratives. The civilization didn't fit European assumptions about African capabilities, technological development, or social organization. It suggested that alternative paths to prosperity and power were not only possible but had actually been achieved centuries before European expansion began. The tiered long-term historical impact of Great Zimbabwe extends far beyond its physical ruins. The kingdoms that emerged from its diaspora, Mutapa, Torwa, and others, continued many of its traditions and maintained some of its trading relationships well into the colonial period. The architectural techniques developed at Great Zimbabwe influenced building traditions throughout the region. Most importantly, the social and economic innovations pioneered there provided a template for African resistance to colonial domination. Modern archaeology has vindicated the oral traditions of the Shona people and revealed the true scope of Great Zimbabwe's achievement. Carbon dating, architectural analysis, and artifact studies have confirmed that this was indeed an indigenous African civilization of extraordinary sophistication. The site was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1986, finally receiving the international recognition it deserved. But the moral assessment of Great Zimbabwe remains complex. On one hand, it represents humanity at its best, a civilization that achieved prosperity through cooperation, maintained environmental sustainability for centuries, and created inclusive social systems that integrated diverse populations. The absence of evidence for slavery, environmental destruction, or systematic oppression sets it apart from most historical empires. On the other hand, Great Zimbabwe's ultimate failure to adapt to changing circumstances raises uncomfortable questions about the sustainability of any civilization, no matter how well-intentioned. The decision to abandon the city rather than transform it suggests both admirable restraint and tragic inflexibility. The modern relevance of Great Zimbabwe's story is striking. In an era of climate change, economic inequality, and international conflict, the Zimbabwean model of sustainable prosperity and cooperative development offers valuable insights. Their success in managing urban growth, Maintaining environmental balance and creating inclusive economic systems provides lessons for contemporary challenges. Most importantly, Great Zimbabwe challenges us to question assumptions about historical inevitability and cultural superiority. It demonstrates that the path to civilization taken by Europe and Asia was not the only possible one, and perhaps not the best one. The Shona people of Great Zimbabwe achieved something remarkable. They created a great civilization without destroying their environment, exploiting their neighbors, or abandoning their values. What would you have done faced with the impossible choices that confronted Great Zimbabwe's final leaders? Could you have found a way to preserve their achievements while adapting to unstoppable change? The ruins of Great Zimbabwe stand as both an inspiration and a warning, proof that alternative forms of civilization are possible, but also evidence that even the most admirable human achievements are fragile in the face of historical forces. Search BID, 200-year-old mystery of Great Zimbabwe ultimately isn't about a vanished civilization, it's about the roads not taken in human history and the question of whether we can still choose to walk them. What's your take on Great Zimbabwe's legacy? Was their peaceful dissolution a failure or the ultimate expression of their values? Share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to explore more forgotten civilizations that challenge everything we think we know about the human story.